Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'd like to begin just by expressing my thanks to the festival organisers. I was absolutely thrilled to be invited to speak here, not just because it's the Sydney Opera House, and of course if I'd known there was going to be a disco ball I would have been even more excited, but because sex and brains make the perfect combination for a festival of dangerous ideas, but not always for the reasons people think. We have a habit of seeing danger in all the wrong places when it comes to this topic. In the late 19th century, when women were pestering for greater access to higher education, Edward Clarke of the Harvard Medical School argued that when adolescent girls and young women think too hard, energy rushes dangerously from ovaries to brain. His best-selling book, Sex and Education, which was subtitled somewhat ironically, as it turned out, or A Fair Chance for Girls, is an absolutely terrifying catalogue of the psychological and medical ills that can befall women, occasionally lethal consequences of this deadly competition for energy between the female reproductive system and the female brain. Considered no less dangerous in the early 20th century was women's suffrage. The eminent neurologist, Dr. Charles Dana, writing on the topic in the New York Times, warned that due to their more delicate nervous systems, if women achieve the feministic ideal and live as men do, they would incur the risk of 25% more insanity than they have now. Which I think you'll agree is admirably precise. In his view, policymakers should take seriously the distinct possibility that, as he put it, women's suffrage would throw in the electorate a mass of voters of delicate nervous stability which might do injury to itself without promoting the community's good. So where exactly in the female nervous system did the problem lie? Well, Dr. Dana pointed out that the upper half of the spinal cord that controls the pelvis and limbs is larger in women. Implications for women's suffrage? Well, to Dr. Dana, and I think the key to understanding his chain of thought here may lie in the word pelvis. This suggested that women's efficiency lies in a special field and not that of political initiative or of judicial authority in a community's organisation. Now, today, of course, with females outnumbering males in university enrolments, not to mention Julia Gillard, the idea of women getting a university degree or marking an X on a ballot form no longer seem quite the grave threats to their health and sanity that they once did. But the topic of sex differences and the brain still seems dangerous, perhaps not quite as dangerous as this, but still, a bit edgy. So where exactly does the danger now lie? Now, some people, if they've been invited here instead of me, and I have to say I'm very glad that they weren't, they would tell you that it's dangerous because the stifling political correctness of our society prevents all but the bravest scientists and commentators from pointing out the unwelcome truth of hardwired sex differences in the brain. For example, at the beginning of his popular book, The Essential Difference, The Truth About the Male and Female Brain, Cambridge University psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen describes the idea of an essential difference between the sexes as politically dangerous. It took him a while, he says, to summon up the courage to publicly present his idea that the male brain is predominantly hardwired to understand systems, a system as being, for example, a technical system or a scientific system or a social system or a business system or a legal system. And the female brain is predominantly hardwired to empathise, that is, of course, to intuit other people's thoughts and feelings and respond sympathetically to them. And a colleague of Baron-Cohen's, Cambridge scientist Peter Lawrence, blames Baron-Cohen's predicament on what he describes as the observed taboo surrounding the idea that men and women might be inherently psychologically different. And he tells us that the dream some people hold of sex equality, to quote, is sustained by a cult of political correctness that ignores the facts of life. New York Times columnist John Tierney agrees. In a recent article he wrote, entitled, Note, Daring to Discuss Women in Science, he quips that the evidence he presents in his article about differences in the sexes' aptitude for maths and science puts him at risk of being shipped off to a gender equity workshop. A hellish fate indeed. Supposedly, we just don't want to hear that we're hardwired differently. Louann Brizendine, alumna of Harvard Medical School and author of the bestseller The Female Brain and her more recent companion volume, The Male Brain, writes of having struggled with two voices in my head. One is the scientific truth, the other is political correctness. I've chosen to emphasize scientific truth over political correctness, even though scientific truths may not always be welcome. Now, if these commentators were here, they would, I think, tell you that it's dangerous to talk about sex differences in the brain and what they might mean for our prospects for greater sex equality, because a politically correct public just doesn't want to know. But these and other commentators would also argue that we can't not talk about the evidence for hardwired sex differences, because that, too, is dangerous. For example, Harvard University's Steven Pinker argues that our mentality of taboo, as he puts it, puts the women's movement on a collision course with the findings of science and the spirit of free inquiry. Now, clearly, no one in their right minds would want to collide with those. Louann Brizendine tells her female readers that they can make better life choices if only they understand their innate biology. In her book, for example, we discover that combining motherhood with career gives rise to a neurological, to quote, tug of war because of overloaded brain circuits. Do working mothers' brains actually ever explode? Dr. Brizendine doesn't say, but it certainly sounds dangerous to me. And rather less dramatically, but no less importantly, these and other commentators express fear that women will take on demands or occupations to which they're not intrinsically suited, and that hopes, efforts, and resources may be wasted in futile attempts to increase sex equality. So is this where the danger now lies? Now, I agree that it is dangerous to talk about sex differences in the brain and what they mean for sex inequality. But the danger is not the risk of a chilly reception from a politically correct public hostile to the very idea of innate sex differences. It's dangerous because in 50 or 100 years' time, when society has changed and when science has advanced, these confident claims about why our different brains mean that the sexes can never be equal will be seen to be clearly, horribly, embarrassingly wrong. I also agree that it is dangerous to ignore what the science of sex differences tells us. But the danger is not that ignoring the science will cause us to waste effort and resources striving pointlessly for greater sex equality. It's because what the science of sex differences really suggests is that this popular idea of a male brain hardwired to understand the world and a female brain hardwired to understand people does not enjoy scientific support, yet has the psychological power to create self-fulfilling prophecies and to hinder progress towards greater sex equality. I have some bad news for you, and I have some good news. The bad news is that I've now spoiled all of your chances of ever writing a massively successful, best-selling, popular book about gender and the brain. And the reason is you now know too much, and your understanding of the issues is too sophisticated. So if anyone had hopes in that direction, I am really very sorry about that. But the good news is that we've finally made it to the last part of our journey from fetal testosterone to brain and to behaviour. We've got to behaviour, the differences in which males and females think and feel, and what they're drawn to and what they're good at. And here at least we're on solid ground, aren't we? Well, one thing to bear in mind is that over the long term that ground has been slowly but surely shrinking. Consider the fields of law, medicine and maths. Just a few decades ago, women were very much a minority in these courses. Today, at entry at least, they're at parity. And even in currently male-dominated fields like physics and engineering, numbers have had quadrupled over the past 30 years. Why would we think that we've now reached some kind of natural limit? Then consider female ambition. As recently as the 1950s, women appeared to have few ambitions beyond the confines of the home. When they got married, they quit their jobs. But as the barriers have come down, women have stampeded into the workplace, they've stampeded into previously male domains, and they've worked hard to succeed there, and they have succeeded there, despite often having to put up with family-unfriendly workplace policies, an exhausting second shift of childcare and housework, less pay than their male counterparts, unconscious discrimination, and in some cases, work environments that are openly hostile to women. Now, this extraordinary social change in women's ambitions has presumably taken place in the absence of any such remarkable changes in their hard wiring. And this scope for massive social change is part of what makes claims about hardwired sex differences so very dangerous. We can laugh at Dr. Charles Dana, the neurologist who thought the female spinal cord not quite the right proportions for voting, not just because the spinal cord, because the idea that the spinal cord forms a sort of critical part of the neural circuitry involved in politics, other than enabling you to actually walk to the polling booth, is so crude and misguided, we can see that now, but also because it turns out that women can vote without going insane. And we can laugh at Dr. Edward Clark, the medic who thought that the mental demands of higher education were so dangerous to women, not just because, of course, it turns out that there is enough energy to go around, but it turns out also that women can get a degree without being rendered infertile. So first of all, let's have some humility about our current neuroscientific knowledge, because in another 100 years it will seem very crude and basic. But also, and perhaps more importantly, let's try to stretch our imagination further than these illustrious men managed to, and ask ourselves this: when men and women's lives and achievements get closer still, who will we be laughing at in 50, 100 years' time? And even in the short term, from one moment to the next, sex differences in behaviour and interests, the supposedly solid ground, can shift and shake and even disappear altogether. And the reason is that our minds are exquisitely socially attuned and surprisingly sensitive to gender stereotypes. And what social psychologists find is that when gender fades into the psychological background, men and women's behaviour becomes remarkably similar, even in areas where traditionally they would behave or perform differently. But when environment makes gender salient, even subtly, there's a ripple effect on the mind. Our thinking, our behaviour, the way we perceive ourselves, what we're good at, what we're interested in, all becomes more consistent with gender stereotypes. Now, there are many demonstrations of this, but let me just give you two examples. One of a quintessential female skill, empathising, and one of a quintessential male skill, maths. So we'll start with empathy. I'm all for empathy, but why does it have to be such a female thing? That's what I wonder. In the female brain, one of my favourite lines, Luann Brizendine describes the female brain as a high-performance emotion machine geared to tracking, moment by moment, the non-verbal signals of the innermost feelings of others. Must we, Luann? Really? All the time? Can't we use our brains for something a bit more interesting, like reading a book? But also, it seems that sex differences in the ability to stalk the private feelings of others as though they were terrified prey is surprisingly sensitive to social cues. The psychologist William Ickes, who have developed one of the most stringent tests of empathic accuracy that actually assesses your ability to guess what other people are thinking and feeling from a real, spontaneous, natural social interaction, has found that while you might expect men to struggle with such a demanding test, they do not. In the first 7 studies that they used using this test, they found that whether you're using strangers or married couples or anything in between, men performed just as well as women. But then suddenly, in the next 3 studies, women started to outperform men. And I thought, well, why? And it turned out there had been a slight change in the form they'd been using. The new form, after they asked each person what was the person thinking then, asked them, how accurate do you think you are? And what Ickes and his colleagues did was they did a meta-analysis which pulled the data from a total of 15 studies, some of which used the old form, some of which used the new form, to see what the effect of the change was. And the result was clear. When the new form was used that asked about accuracy, womanly intuition existed. When the old form was used, it didn't. Why? Because a small change reminds women that they should be empathic, and it increases their motivation on the task. Same with maths. Of course, there's a cultural stereotype that males are superior at maths. A very large body of research, confirmed now in 2 large meta-analyses, shows that the widely known belief that men are better at maths interferes with women's mathematical ability, a phenomenon known as stereotype threat. Blow the cloud of stereotype threat away, for example, by reassuring women that on this test no gender differences are seen, and their mathematical ability, normally undermined, is unleashed. They perform better than you'd expect from their test or course grades, and they perform better than men with the same test or course grades. And there are very many of these studies of this kind now that show the sensitivity of our minds to gender stereotypes. And the problem is that confident claims about male brains hardwired to understand the world and female brains hardwired to understand people reinforce those stereotypes, bring them legitimacy. And what's disturbing, given how careless the treatment of the topic of sex differences in the brain is that it seems to be the underlying assumption that differences between the sexes are hardwired that gives gender stereotypes their psychological potency. As a few studies have now found, if you say, yes, there's a gender gap and its nature, you see the usual stereotype threat effects. But if you tell women instead, yes, there is a gender gap, but it's actually to do with nature, its experiences, its socialisation, performance improves. And what this suggests is not the mere belief that there are sex differences in ability that interferes with women's mathematical ability, it's the belief that those differences are due to hardwiring, that they're natural, inevitable, and immutable. And this brings us to an important point. These ideas of hardwired sex differences let us off the hook. If they're true, we can stop looking to ourselves, to our society, to explain sex inequality, and instead we can just blame our different brains. University of Exeter psychologist Thomas Morton and his colleagues have found that people who've just read scientific claims about hardwired sex differences, compared with those who are told that the ideas are under debate, express more confidence that society treats women fairly. They're less confident that the gender status quo could ever change, and the men are much more supportive of sex discrimination in the workplace after reading about hardwired sex differences. And this is the second reason why it's dangerous to ignore the science of sex differences. Not because ignoring the science will cause us to waste our time riling against implacable nature and striving for greater sex equality, it's because what the science of sex differences really tells us is this popular idea of a male brain hardwired to understand and change and advance the world, and a female brain hardwired to take care of those who do and iron their shirts, does not enjoy the scientific support we are so often told it does, yet has the psychological power to create self-fulfilling prophecies and hinder progress towards greater sex equality. I have little doubt that the current neuroscientific explanations for sex inequality will end up on this scientific scrap heap along with all those of the past. But always, before this happens, speculation becomes elevated to the status of fact. These facts about male and female brains become part of the culture, often lingering on well past their best-by dates. Here, they reinforce and legitimate the gender stereotypes that interact with our minds, helping to sustain the very sex inequalities that the neuroscientific claims seek to explain. And so, I end with a plea. Let's open our eyes to where the dangers really lie and stop looking where they don't. When mishandled, sex and brains make a dangerous combination. So to those not able or not willing to handle the topic with the care and the caution that it needs and that it deserves, I say this: please, just put the brain down and step away.